The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, written in the careful copper-plate hand that Miss Jane Marple remembered from her youth. "My dear Jane," it began, "I fear something dreadful is stirring in Little Wickham, and I find myself quite out of my depth. You always had such a talent for seeing what the rest of us missed. If you could spare the time for an old friend." The letter was signed by Millicent Hartwell, her dearest companion from those long-ago days when they were both young women with more curiosity than sense. By the time Miss Marple had arranged her affairs and made the journey to Little Wickham, Millicent was dead. A sudden heart attack, the doctor said, though the neighbors whispered of how troubled she had seemed in her final weeks. Miss Marple found herself the inheritor of Rose Cottage and its secrets, including a blue leather journal hidden beneath Millicent's correspondence, filled with observations about the village that grew increasingly urgent toward the final entries. Now, on this perfect June afternoon, Miss Marple sat beneath the shade of an ancient elm on the village green, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm as she observed the annual summer fete. Little Wickham had changed remarkably little in the 30 years since her last visit. The same honey-colored cottages clustered around the green. The same church spire pierced the cloudless sky, and the same sense of timeless English tranquility pervaded the scene. The fete buzzed with the gentle energy of a community celebrating itself. Bunting fluttered from every available post and tree, its cheerful triangles of red, white, and blue creating a festive canopy over the proceedings. The scent of fresh baked scones and strawberry jam drifted from the Women's Institute stall, while children darted between the adults with the boundless energy of youth released from the constraints of Sunday best behavior. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the village's unofficial social director, moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of a general reviewing troops. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged despite the afternoon breeze, and her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The elderflower cordial goes on the refreshment table. "Isabel, dear," she called to a young woman with auburn hair who was arranging glass jugs with artistic precision. "And do mind the wasps. They're particularly attracted to the elderflower this year." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes followed the interaction with interest. Isabel Price, she had learned from the village gossip network, was the local schoolmistress and something of an artist in her spare time. The girl moved with the careful grace of someone perpetually conscious of being observed, her hands trembling slightly as she positioned the jugs on the white-clothed table. "Miss Marple?" A cheerful voice interrupted her observations. Dr. Geoffrey Rowe approached with the brisk stride of a man accustomed to making rounds. His spectacles caught the afternoon light as he settled beside her on the bench. "Eleanor mentioned you'd returned to us. Quite a homecoming, I should think, after all these years." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, her needles never pausing in their work, "though I find the village much as I remembered it. Some things, it seems, are wonderfully resistant to change." Dr. Rowe chuckled, though Miss Marple detected a slight strain in his manner. "Oh, we've had our share of excitement lately. Poor Millicent's passing, of course, and before that, old Geoffrey Ashworth. The postmaster, you know. Heart attack while sorting the morning mail. Quite shocking, really. He'd seemed in perfect health," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically while filing away the information. Millicent's journal had mentioned both deaths, along with several other incidents that individually seemed unremarkable, but together suggested a pattern that had clearly troubled her old friend. The afternoon wore on in pleasant routine until the moment came for the traditional toast to the village. Mr. Lionel Blount, the local solicitor and a man of considerable self-importance, mounted the small platform erected near the refreshment table. His carefully brushed hair gleamed silver in the sunlight, and he had the satisfied air of someone about to deliver wisdom to an appreciative audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the green, "it is my great pleasure to propose a toast to Little Wickham, our beloved village, and to the generous spirit that makes occasions like this possible." Isabel Price stepped forward with a silver tray bearing a crystal glass, filled with the pale, cloudy liquid that was Mrs. Pemberton's famous elderflower cordial. The girl's hands shook slightly as she offered the glass, and Miss Marple noticed how her eyes seemed to avoid meeting Mr. Blount's directly. Mr. Blount accepted the glass with a gracious nod and raised it toward the assembled crowd. "To Little Wickham," he declared, "and to the friendships that bind us together through all seasons of life." He lifted the glass to his lips and drank deeply. For a moment, nothing seemed amiss. Then his expression changed, not dramatically, but with the subtle shift of a man realizing something was terribly wrong. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the platform's wooden edge, and Mr. Blount clutched at his throat with both hands. Dr. Rowe was moving before the glass had finished falling, but Miss Marple could see from his expression that he already knew it was too late. The solicitor collapsed with a strangled gasp, his body convulsing once before going terrifyingly still. In the shocked silence that followed, Miss Marple's trained eye took in the scene with the systematic attention that had served her so well in the past. She noted Isabel Price's ashen face and trembling hands, Mrs. Pemberton's carefully controlled expression of horror, and the way several villagers instinctively stepped back from the refreshment table as if it had suddenly become dangerous. Most interesting of all was the elderflower jug itself. While the lemonade in its companion vessel remained clear and golden, the elderflower cordial had developed a faint, oily film on its surface that caught the light in an unnatural way. Near the base of the platform, the shattered remains of Mr. Blount's glass gleamed wetly, and Miss Marple could just detect a bitter, almond-like scent that had nothing to do with elderflowers. "Heart attack," Dr. Rowe announced grimly, though his eyes met Miss Marple's with an expression that suggested he suspected otherwise. "We'll need to contact the police, of course. Protocol in cases of sudden death." As the crowd began to disperse in hushed, frightened groups, Miss Marple remained seated on her bench, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She thought of Millicent's final journal entry. "I believe I know the truth now, but I dare not commit it to paper. If something should happen to me, Jane will understand what needs to be done." The peaceful afternoon had indeed been shattered, but Miss Marple suspected that Mr. Blount's death was not the beginning of Little Wickham's troubles. It was merely the latest chapter in a story that had been unfolding for some time. And somewhere in this seemingly innocent gathering of neighbors and friends was someone who had just committed murder with the casual efficiency of someone pouring tea. Her pale blue eyes swept the dispersing crowd once more, cataloguing faces and reactions with the methodical precision that had made her reputation. The game, as they say, was afoot. By evening, the cheerful bunting seemed to droop with the weight of tragedy, and the village green emptied in anxious clusters, each group carrying away fragments of rumor and speculation. Inspector David Craddock arrived within the hour, his lean frame and weary expression suggesting a man well acquainted with human nature's darker aspects. Miss Marple observed him from her bench, noting how his practiced eye missed nothing as he surveyed the disrupted fate with methodical precision. Dr. Rowe stood beside the covered body, his usual confidence replaced by visible unease. "Natural causes, most likely," he explained to the inspector, though his voice lacked conviction. Mr. Blount had been under considerable stress lately, his practice expanding, complications with recent cases. The hesitation in his words did not escape Miss Marple's attention, nor did the meaningful glance he exchanged with Mrs. Pemberton. The official investigation began with quiet efficiency, but a different kind of inquiry was already spreading through the village like ripples on a disturbed pond. Forced to disperse from the immediate crime scene, the villagers congregated in small, whispering groups, their carefully maintained facade of harmony beginning to crack under the pressure of sudden tragedy. Mrs. Giles, the baker's wife, was among the first to offer her theory to anyone within earshot. "It was his heart, I tell you," she declared, fanning herself with a church program. "Always eating too much rich food, that man, and the stress of his legal work. Providence, perhaps. A warning against excess. Her husband nodded vaguely, though his nervous glances toward the refreshment table suggested his own doubts about such a convenient explanation. Near the prize, dahlias, Miss Agatha Finch, the village's self-appointed moral guardian, had formed her own conclusions. Nonsense, she sniffed to Mrs. Albright and several other listeners. Mr. Blount was robust enough for all his faults. He'd been making enemies lately. That business with the church land, the boundary dispute with Henderson. Someone was bound to take exception to his methods. Mrs. Albright wrung her hands at such harsh speculation, her gentle nature recoiling from the suggestion of deliberate malice in their quiet community. Miss Marple absorbed these fragmented conversations with scholarly intensity, her pale blue eyes cataloguing not just the words, but the speaker's expressions and body language. She noticed how few mentioned the cordial itself, or the suddenness of the collapse, as if their minds sought to normalize the tragedy within familiar frameworks of natural death or understandable conflict. Inspector Craddock approached the refreshment table with careful steps. "The elderflower cordial," he said, his tone neutral but penetrating. "Who prepared it?" Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward with characteristic authority. "I did, Inspector. My grandmother's recipe. I've made it for 20 years. Her composure was admirable, though Miss Marple detected the slightest tremor beneath the steady voice. Isabel helped serve it today, of course. When called forward, Isabel Price moved with reluctant steps, her auburn hair catching the late sunlight. Her hands continued trembling despite obvious efforts at control. "I served Mr. Blount his drink," she confirmed in barely a whisper. "It's traditional for the youngest woman to serve the speaker." She paused, color rising in her cheeks. "I didn't want to, actually. Mr. Blount and I had disagreed recently about my teaching methods. He felt they were too progressive." This admission sent ripples of interest through the watching crowd. Dr. Rowe frowned thoughtfully while Mrs. Pemberton's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Most intriguing was James Fletcher's reaction. The retired bank manager showed not surprise, but something resembling satisfaction. "What sort of disagreement?" Inspector Craddock inquired gently. Isabel's voice grew stronger, with anger replacing fear. "He threatened to have me dismissed, said my influence was unsuitable. He'd been investigating my background, making inquiries." Her chin lifted defiantly. He had no real authority over the school, but he was on the parish council and knew how to make life difficult. "That's quite enough," Mrs. Pemberton interrupted sharply. "Speaking ill of the dead serves no purpose. Lionel may have been particular, but he was a pillar of this community." Miss Marple found this exchange fascinating on multiple levels. The tension between the two women was palpable, suggesting undercurrents extending far beyond the current tragedy. Mrs. Pemberton's fervent defense seemed oddly intense for a mere fellow villager. Meanwhile, Thomas Albright, the vicar's theatrical son, was sharing his own theories with a group of younger men. "It's poison," he declared with morbid excitement. "That almond smell. I've read about cyanide. Someone slipped it into the cordial. Blount wasn't universally liked, was he? The Henderson foreclosure, that business with the village hall funds." Dr. Rowe, having completed his examination, stood apart with slumped shoulders. He offered Miss Marple a tired smile. "Terrible business. One never expects such things in Little Wickham." His conventional words carried an undertone of deeper disquiet, and she noticed his careful avoidance of looking toward the elderflower jug. As shadows lengthened across the green, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's revelations. 3 deaths in as many months, each apparently natural, but occurring in a community where such losses typically separated by years rather than weeks. Millicent's journal had hinted at patterns within patterns, and now she was beginning to perceive the shape of something far more complex than a simple village tragedy. The murder had not merely claimed a life, it had irrevocably altered Little Wickham's quiet rhythm, exposing the web of secrets and suspicions that bound the community together and now threatened to tear it apart. The morning after the tragedy brought an unseasonal chill to Little Wickham, as if the village itself had drawn inward against the shadow of sudden death. Miss Marple rose early, her first task to examine Millicent's journal more carefully in the clear light of recent events. The blue leather book revealed a disturbing pattern when read with knowledge of Mr. Blount's fate. Millicent had documented a series of seemingly unrelated incidents over the past months: sudden illnesses, unexpected departures, and what she termed pressures applied and then curiously relieved. Most telling was her final entry. Lionel has been asking the same questions I have. Someone will not allow this to continue. Inspector Craddock's preliminary findings confirmed everyone's suspicions. The elderflower cordial had indeed contained hydrogen cyanide, but the method of introduction proved more sophisticated than expected. The poison was concentrated near the surface, he explained to Dr. Rowe and Miss Marple during their chance encounter near the post office. Not uniformly distributed throughout the liquid, suggesting it was added to the individual glass rather than the serving vessel itself. This revelation cast the crime in an entirely different light. The killer had possessed not only access and opportunity, but also precise knowledge of the ceremonial toast protocol and the chemical properties of cyanide. Miss Marple absorbed this information while noting Dr. Rowe's visible discomfort at the technical details. Mrs. Dorothy Kettering, the new postmistress, proved an invaluable source of village intelligence. Mr. Blount had been making unusual inquiries lately, she confided while sorting the morning mail. Asking about families who'd moved away, deaths from years past. Said it was legal research, but it felt more personal somehow. This corroborated Millicent's observations about the solicitor's growing suspicions regarding the village's recent mortality rate. The obvious suspect remained Isabel Price, whose nervous behavior and admitted conflict with the deceased painted a damning picture. Inspector Craddock had focused his investigation accordingly, and village opinion was solidifying around her guilt. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by this convenient solution. The young schoolmistress's transparent emotions and obvious distress seemed inconsistent with the calculating precision required for such a murder. During her morning walk, Miss Marple observed the various reactions to the confirmed poisoning. Mrs. Pemberton maintained her characteristic composure, though her defense of Mr. Blount struck Miss Marple as oddly vehement. Truth is a luxury one earns by behaving. She had told Isabel in what she presumably thought was a private moment. The phrase lodged in Miss Marple's mind as the sort of statement that revealed more about the speaker than the intended recipient. Dr. Rowe appeared genuinely distressed, yet his initial misdiagnosis of heart attack raised questions about either competence or intent. His hasty correction, once the almond scent became apparent, suggested someone with intimate knowledge of cyanide's effects. Miss Marple recalled his nervous hands and haunted expression, wondering what fears drove such obvious anxiety. The refreshment table's chain of custody presented numerous opportunities for poisoning. Mrs. Pemberton had prepared the cordial at home, but multiple villagers had helped with setup. Mrs. Giles, Thomas Albright, James Fletcher, and others. Any of them could have introduced the poison during the afternoon's preparations, yet the concentration near the liquid's surface suggested last-minute addition. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a detail from Millicent's journal that initially seemed irrelevant. Her friend had noted the presence of rare wildflowers near Mr. Blount's estate wall, despite his obsession with maintaining perfectly manicured grounds. Millicent's botanical observations were always precise, making this inconsistency particularly intriguing. Had someone been cultivating plants for purposes beyond mere gardening? The village's collective rush to blame Isabel Price troubled Miss Marple's sense of justice. True killers, in her experience, were far more accomplished at concealing guilt behind appropriate masks of shock and grief. They also typically possessed specialized knowledge that a village school mistress would be unlikely to acquire through normal channels. Inspector Craddock's methodical approach was admirable, but Miss Marple sensed he was being led toward predetermined conclusions by the very obviousness of the evidence against Isabel. The real murderer had been careful to establish a clear alternative suspect while maintaining their own facade of innocence. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the green, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's revelations. The physical evidence pointed toward Isabel with damning clarity, yet fundamental questions remained unanswered. Where would a young teacher acquire knowledge of cyanide's properties? How could she have timed the poison's introduction with such precision? Most importantly, why would she choose such a public, traceable method when simpler alternatives existed? The answers, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in the obvious motives and opportunities, but in the deeper patterns Millicent had begun to uncover before her own untimely death. Someone in Little Wickham possessed both the knowledge and ruthlessness to commit multiple murders while maintaining a perfect facade of respectability. The challenge would be identifying that person before they struck again, for Miss Marple was increasingly certain that Mr. Blount's death was merely the latest chapter in a longer, more sinister story. The investigation was far from over, and the true killer remained hidden among the familiar faces of village life, protected by assumptions and misdirection that had already claimed 2 lives. Inspector Craddock arrived at the village hall the following morning with the satisfied air of a man whose case was proceeding exactly as expected. The evidence against Isabel Price had crystallized overnight into what he considered an unshakable foundation for prosecution. A thorough search of her cottage had yielded a chemistry textbook with detailed annotations about hydrogen cyanide, its properties, and lethal dosages. More damning still, the local chemist confirmed that Miss Price had purchased a commercial weed killer containing potassium cyanide just 3 weeks prior, ostensibly for the school garden but suspiciously close to the timing of Mr. Blount's death. The village's collective reaction was one of profound relief mixed with theatrical shock. Mrs. Pemberton expressed her satisfaction with characteristic authority, declaring to anyone within earshot that justice was finally being served. "One cannot challenge the established order without consequences," she proclaimed, her words carrying an undertone that Miss Marple found curiously intense. The phrase seemed to encompass more than mere commentary on a murder case, suggesting deeper currents of control and retribution that extended beyond the immediate tragedy. Dr. Rowe appeared genuinely distressed by the turn of events, his usual professional composure cracking under the strain of seeing a young woman he had known as patient and dedicated, now branded as a calculated killer. His hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles during their chance encounter outside the chemist's shop, and Miss Marple noted how he avoided meeting her eyes directly when discussing the case. "She's barely 25, he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of personal anguish. "Hardly seems the type for such calculated violence." His obvious emotional investment in Isabel's fate struck Miss Marple as disproportionate for a mere professional acquaintance. The discovery of the chemistry textbook troubled Miss Marple considerably, not because it implicated Isabel, but because it seemed almost too convenient. The relevant passages about cyanide were highlighted in bright yellow marker, the annotations written in a hand that, while superficially similar to Isabel's, showed subtle differences in letter formation that suggested careful imitation rather than natural writing. Moreover, the book appeared remarkably pristine for a text that had supposedly been in regular use, its spine unbroken and pages uncreased in the manner of a recent purchase rather than a well-studied reference. Miss Marple's own investigation into Isabel's character revealed a picture entirely at odds with the calculating poisoner the evidence suggested. Mrs. Hartwell at the village shop remembered the young teacher as unfailingly patient and kind. someone who stayed after hours to help struggling students and never raised her voice, even with the most difficult children. The local parents spoke of her with genuine affection, praising her innovative teaching methods and her ability to inspire learning in children who had previously shown little academic interest. More intriguingly, Miss Marple discovered that Isabel's conflict with Mr. Blount had roots deeper than professional disagreement. Through careful inquiry, she learned that the solicitor had been conducting an unusually thorough investigation into the young woman's family background, going back several generations with the sort of meticulous attention typically reserved for matters of inheritance or legal dispute. Thomas Albright, in an unguarded moment, revealed that Mr. Blount claimed to be protecting the village's moral standards, but his methods suggested something more personal and vindictive than professional concern. The parish records yielded a fascinating revelation that cast the entire situation in a different light. Isabel Price was not merely a young teacher who had arrived in Little Wickham seeking employment. She was the granddaughter of Margaret Thornton, a woman whose name appeared repeatedly in the older church records under circumstances that suggested considerable scandal. The connection explained Mr. Blount's intense interest in her background and perhaps provided a motive for his harassment that extended beyond mere professional disagreement. James Fletcher's behavior during this period also warranted closer scrutiny. His reaction to Mr. Blount's death had been described by several witnesses as satisfaction, and his subsequent comments about restoring order carried undertones of personal relief rather than community concern. Miss Marple recalled Millicent's cryptic journal entries about old financial matters and debts of conscience that suggested the retired bank manager harbored secrets that a thorough solicitor might uncover. Dr. Rowe's medical knowledge made him another compelling alternative suspect. His initial misdiagnosis of heart attack, quickly corrected once the almond scent became apparent, suggested either professional incompetence or deliberate misdirection. His obvious distress over Isabel's arrest seemed disproportionate unless he feared that further investigation might expose his own involvement or reveal uncomfortable truths about his medical practice. The timeline of the poisoning itself presented additional problems with the case against Isabel. Several witnesses placed her at the school until late afternoon on the day before the fete, making it difficult for her to have prepared the concentrated cyanide solution that the forensic evidence suggested. Moreover, her visible nervousness while serving the cordial seemed inconsistent with someone who had deliberately poisoned it moments before. A truly guilty party would more likely have displayed calm confidence or carefully rehearsed grief. As evening settled over Little Wickham, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations with growing certainty that Isabel Price was being systematically framed for a crime she did not commit. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to establish the young teacher as the obvious suspect while carefully concealing their own involvement. The real murderer possessed not only the chemical knowledge and opportunity to commit the crime, but also the calculating intelligence to manipulate evidence and public opinion with remarkable skill. The challenge now was to identify that person before they could complete their deadly work by ensuring that an innocent woman paid the ultimate price for their carefully orchestrated deception. Miss Marple's investigation took on new urgency the following morning when she made a discovery that transformed her understanding of both the crime and the criminal. While helping Mrs. Kettering sort through Mr. Blount's accumulated correspondence, she found a receipt from a London antiquarian bookshop for a volume titled Botanical Poisons of the British Isles, purchased just 2 weeks before his death. The solicitor, it appeared, had been conducting research of his own, suggesting he was not merely a victim but an investigator who had grown dangerously close to uncovering the truth about Little Wickham's recent mortality statistics. This revelation cast the entire case in a different light. Rather than being murdered for his interference in Isabel's teaching methods, Mr. Blount had likely been silenced because his systematic investigation threatened to expose a pattern of deaths that someone desperately needed to keep hidden. Millicent's journal entries about patterns within patterns suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through this lens of methodical elimination rather than random tragedy. Armed with this new perspective, Miss Marple paid a seemingly innocent social call to Mrs. Pemberton at Elm House, arriving with fresh gooseberry tarts and the manner of an old friend resuming comfortable habits. The kitchen, with its gleaming copper and precise organization, revealed telling details to her trained eye. Among the polishes and cleaning supplies on the scullery shelf stood a brown glass bottle with a freshly rewritten label, Cherry Laurel Water. The scent that lingered faintly on the linen napkins was not lavender or rose, but something with a bitter, almond-like undertone that Miss Marple recognized with growing certainty. Mrs. Pemberton explained her domestic routine with characteristic efficiency. "I use a little laurel water for the drawers and to discourage flies from the sweets," she said briskly. "Wasps detest it particularly. I always brush a bit on the serving trays during summer gatherings." The casual admission sent a chill through Miss Marple, who remembered her mother's stern warnings about cherry laurel's deadly properties. Prunus laurocerasus, she recalled from her botanical studies, yielded prussic acid, the same hydrogen cyanide that had killed Mr. Blount. After leaving Elm House, Miss Marple examined the laurel bush in Mrs. Pemberton's garden, noting several freshly clipped sprigs. The pieces of the puzzle began forming a coherent picture. Mrs. Pemberton's established habit of using laurel water to discourage insects provided perfect cover for introducing cyanide into the elderflower. Cordial. More significantly, it explained the subtle detail that had troubled Miss Marple since the fete, the oily film she had observed on the cordial's surface. The film had not been poison itself, but residue from the delivery method. Mrs. Pemberton had likely prepared a concentrated solution of cherry laurel extract in an oily solvent, allowing her to add precise drops to Mr. Blount's glass while maintaining the pretense of arranging the refreshment table. Miss Marple distinctly remembered the woman's seemingly innocent gesture near the elderflower jug, her fingers brushing the rim as she ostensibly adjusted a napkin. In that brief moment, traces of the oily solution had contaminated the jug's surface, creating the telltale film that everyone else had dismissed as natural sediment. Dr. Rowe's reaction to her inquiries about Mrs. Pemberton's domestic practices confirmed her suspicions. "I once urged Eleanor to dispose of that laurel water," he admitted with visible discomfort. "Dangerous. Anachronism, I called it. She claimed she used only small amounts to deter wasps, but I'd hoped the bottle was long gone." His obvious anxiety suggested he understood the implications of such household chemistry far better than he cared to admit. The pattern of recent deaths took on sinister clarity when viewed through this lens of systematic elimination. Geoffrey Ashworth, the postmaster, had possessed access to everyone's correspondence and might have noticed suspicious patterns in mail delivery. Millicent had been conducting her own investigation into the village's mortality statistics. Each victim had either discovered inconvenient truths or possessed knowledge that threatened someone's carefully maintained secrets. Mrs. Pemberton's position as the village's unofficial social director provided both means and opportunity for such calculated murders. Her authority in arranging community events gave her access to food and drink preparation, while her intimate knowledge of everyone's affairs allowed her to identify potential threats before they became dangerous. The elderflower cordial had been prepared in her own kitchen, bottled according to her schedule, and served under her direct supervision. The sophistication of the murder method revealed a mind that understood both chemistry and human psychology with frightening precision. Mrs. Pemberton had not only known how to extract and concentrate cyanide from cherry laurel, but had also possessed the insight to manipulate the investigation toward Isabel Price while maintaining her own facade of helpful cooperation. The planted evidence, the conveniently highlighted chemistry textbook, the suspiciously timed weed killer purchase, all bore the hallmarks of someone who understood exactly how police investigations typically proceeded. Most chilling was the realization that Mrs. Pemberton's fierce defense of Mr. Blount's reputation served a dual purpose. By portraying him as a pillar of the community, she deflected attention from his investigative activities while positioning herself as a grieving friend rather than a calculating killer. Her authoritative manner and unquestioned social position had provided perfect camouflage for methodical murder. As evening shadows gathered over Little Wickham, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations with growing certainty that she faced a killer of exceptional cunning and ruthlessness. The challenge now was to prove her suspicions before the fabricated case against Isabel Price reached its inevitable and tragic conclusion. Miss Marple spent the following morning with the methodical precision of a woman sorting decades of accumulated evidence, each piece carefully examined before being placed in its proper context. Millicent's blue journal lay open beside a detailed parish map, and she had marked with discreet pins the locations where recent deaths had occurred alongside the sites of community gatherings arranged by Mrs. Pemberton. The pattern that emerged was both subtle and damning. A clustering around church fetes, harvest suppers, and committee meetings that might appear coincidental to a casual observer, but revealed a more sinister design to someone who had spent a lifetime studying human nature's darker impulses. Her first destination was the vicarage, where she requested access to the old parish records with the apologetic manner of an elderly woman pursuing genealogical curiosities. Thomas Albright, delighted by any opportunity for drama, eagerly assisted her search through dusty ledgers and baptismal registers. It was there that she discovered the crucial connection she had been seeking. Margaret Thornton, Isabel's grandmother, had indeed borne a child out of wedlock, but the father was not some unknown village youth. The carefully preserved records, when cross-referenced with family histories, revealed that the child's father was Edmund Pemberton, Mrs. Pemberton's own uncle and heir to the family's considerable local properties. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of both the current crisis and Mrs. Pemberton's fierce determination to protect her family's reputation. The scandal had been buried through a combination of financial pressure and social intimidation, with the Thornton family losing their land holdings and Margaret herself forced into domestic service to support her illegitimate child. Mr. Blount's recent investigation into Isabel's background had clearly uncovered this explosive secret, threatening to destroy the carefully constructed facade of respectability that Mrs. Pemberton had spent decades maintaining. The genealogical research also explained the systematic nature of recent deaths in Little Wickham. Geoffrey Ashworth, the former postmaster, would have had access to correspondence related to property transfers and family secrets. Millicent had been conducting her own investigation into suspicious mortality patterns. Each victim had either discovered inconvenient truths or possessed knowledge that could expose the web of financial manipulation and social coercion that had shaped the village's current hierarchy. Dr. Rowe's involvement became clearer when Miss Marple discovered references to questionable medical diagnoses in Millicent's journal. The doctor's father had been implicated in several suspicious deaths decades earlier, incidents officially ruled accidental but privately questioned by those with long memories. Mr. Blount's investigation would have inevitably uncovered these irregularities, threatening not only Dr. Rowe's professional reputation, but potentially exposing a family legacy of medical malpractice that could destroy his practice and social standing. James Fletcher's nervous behavior also made perfect sense when viewed through this lens of systematic blackmail and intimidation. Bank records from the period of the Thornton family's financial ruin showed irregularities that suggested embezzlement or deliberate manipulation of village trust funds. Fletcher's gambling debts from his younger years had apparently been resolved through questionable means, creating vulnerabilities that Mrs. Pemberton could exploit to ensure his cooperation in maintaining the village's carefully orchestrated social order. The manufactured evidence against Isabel Price displayed a sophistication that spoke to Mrs. Pemberton's intimate knowledge of police investigative procedures. The conveniently discovered chemistry textbooks, the suspiciously timed purchase of weed killer, and the emergence of witnesses with perfectly damaging testimony all bore the hallmarks of someone who understood exactly what proof would be required to secure a conviction. Mrs. Pemberton's position as the village's social authority provided her with both the means to plant evidence and the credibility to direct suspicion toward her chosen target. Most chilling was the realization that Mrs. Pemberton's method of murder, the use of cherry laurel extract to produce hydrogen cyanide, represented not improvisation, but long-standing preparation. Her established habit of using laurel water to discourage insects at community gatherings provided perfect cover for introducing poison into food and drink, while her authoritative manner ensured that few would question her domestic arrangements or chemical knowledge. The systematic elimination of potential witnesses revealed a criminal intelligence of exceptional cunning and patience. Mrs. Pemberton had spent years identifying threats to her carefully maintained secrets, then methodically removing them through murders that appeared natural or accidental. Her social position allowed her to manipulate investigations while positioning herself as a helpful witness rather than a calculating killer. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries with growing certainty that she faced an adversary whose criminal sophistication matched her own investigative skills. The challenge now was to expose Mrs. Pemberton's guilt before the fabricated case against Isabel Price reached its inevitable conclusion, and before the killer could eliminate any remaining witnesses to her decades of systematic murder and manipulation. The morning brought an oppressive stillness to Little Wickham, as if the village itself held its breath while waiting for the next tragedy to unfold. Isabel Price remained under house arrest, her cottage watched by a constable whose presence served more to satisfy public anxiety than genuine security concerns. Inspector Craddock had grown increasingly confident in his case, the manufactured evidence forming what he believed to be an unshakable foundation for prosecution. The chemistry textbook, the suspicious purchase of weed killer, and the carefully coached witness testimony had created a narrative so compelling that few questioned its convenient completeness. Miss Marple spent the early hours examining Millicent's journal with renewed urgency, her pale blue eyes searching for patterns that might have escaped her initial scrutiny. The entries revealed a woman growing increasingly frightened as she uncovered connections between recent deaths and older, half-forgotten scandals that had shaped the village's social hierarchy. Most troubling were Millicent's final observations about Mrs. Pemberton's unusual interest in botanical specimens and her habit of attending to refreshments at every community gathering where suspicious incidents had occurred. Dr. Rowe's behavior had become increasingly erratic since Mr. Blount's death, his usual professional composure cracking under the weight of knowledge he dared not voice. Miss Marple encountered him near the churchyard that afternoon, his hands trembling as he pretended to examine the memorial plaques with scholarly interest. When he noticed her approach, relief flooded his features with such intensity that she knew immediately he had been seeking this opportunity. "Miss Marple," he began in a voice barely above a whisper, "there are things you must understand about our village. Mr. Blount was investigating more than Isabel's background. He had uncovered financial irregularities, medical records that didn't match official causes of death, property transfers that occurred under suspicious circumstances." His words tumbled out with desperate urgency. "Mrs. Pemberton has been at the center of it all for decades. She knows everyone's secrets, controls every important decision, and eliminates anyone who threatens her position." Before he could continue, the familiar sound of Mrs. Pemberton's measured footsteps approached along the gravel path. Dr. Rowe's face went white, his confession dying on his lips as she appeared with her characteristic smile of polite authority. "Doctor, how fortunate to find you here. I was hoping we might discuss the memorial arrangements for poor Mr. Blount. Such a delicate matter requires careful handling." Her tone was pleasant, but Miss Marple noticed the steel beneath the silk and the way Dr. Rowe seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Of course, Mrs. Pemberton," he replied with forced cheerfulness. "Always happy to assist." As they walked away together, Miss Marple caught his backward glance, a look of such desperate fear that she knew she had just witnessed a man recognizing his own doom. The news came at twilight, delivered by Mrs. Kettering with the breathless excitement of someone bearing momentous tidings. James Fletcher had been found dead in his study, apparently by his own hand. The retired bank manager had left behind a typed confession admitting to poisoning Mr. Blount and expressing remorse for his role in covering up earlier suspicious deaths. The note specifically mentioned his guilt over the Thornton matter and his fear of exposure following Mr. Blount's investigation. Inspector Craddock treated the suicide as vindication of his investigative methods. Fletcher couldn't live with the guilt, he explained to the gathered villagers. His confession clears Miss Price completely and explains the pattern of deaths that had troubled the community. The typed note was produced as evidence, its neat paragraphs detailing a web of financial corruption and murder that painted Fletcher as the mastermind behind decades of criminal activity. Miss Marple examined the suicide scene with the careful attention of someone who had learned to distrust convenient solutions. Fletcher's study showed signs of hasty arrangement. Books repositioned to hide dust patterns, papers stacked with unnatural precision, and most tellingly, a brandy glass that bore no fingerprints despite supposedly being Fletcher's final drink. The typed confession troubled her particularly, as she recalled Fletcher's arthritis making typing painful and his preference for handwritten correspondence. Most damning was the discovery she made upon returning to Rose Cottage that evening. 3 pages had been carefully removed from Millicent's journal, the cuts so precise they suggested surgical instruments rather than hasty tearing. The missing sections had contained detailed observations about Mrs. Pemberton's movements on dates corresponding to suspicious deaths, along with notes about the woman's extensive knowledge of botanical poisons and her access to community gatherings where victims had been present. The pattern of elimination was becoming clear with frightening precision. Mr. Blount had been silenced when his investigation threatened to expose the truth. Dr. Rowe had been murdered before he could share his knowledge with Miss Marple. Now Fletcher's staged suicide provided a convenient scapegoat while eliminating another potential witness to Mrs. Pemberton's decades of systematic murder and manipulation. As darkness settled over Little Wickham, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations with growing certainty that she faced a killer whose sophistication surpassed anything in her previous experience. Mrs. Pemberton had not merely committed murder. She had orchestrated an entire campaign of deception designed to protect her position while eliminating threats with surgical precision. The challenge now was to expose her guilt before she could complete her deadly work by ensuring that all remaining witnesses, including Miss Marple herself, were permanently silenced. The morning brought news that chilled Miss Marple more than the unseasonable weather. Dr. Rowe had been found dead in his surgery, apparently from a heart attack brought on by the stress of recent events. Inspector Craddock accepted this explanation without question, noting the doctor's obvious distress over Fletcher's suicide and the village's tragic losses. Yet Miss Marple remembered their interrupted conversation in the churchyard, and she knew with cold certainty that another witness had been permanently silenced before he could share what he knew about Mrs. Pemberton's decades of systematic murder. The elimination of potential threats was proceeding with frightening efficiency. Fletcher's staged suicide had provided a convenient scapegoat while removing another source of dangerous knowledge. Dr. Rowe's death eliminated the medical professional who might have questioned the pattern of supposedly natural deaths. Miss Marple recognized that she now stood alone as the sole remaining person who understood the true scope of Mrs. Pemberton's crimes, making her the inevitable next target in this carefully orchestrated campaign of murder. The invitation to tea at Elm House arrived that afternoon, delivered by Mrs. Pemberton herself with the gracious manner of a hostess extending neighborly courtesy. "You must allow me to welcome you properly to Little Wickham," she insisted, her smile as perfectly composed as ever. "After all the recent unpleasantness, we must restore our reputation for hospitality." The words were pleasant enough, but Miss Marple detected the steel beneath the silk, the subtle command that made refusal impossible without causing the very suspicion Mrs. Pemberton sought to avoid. Miss Marple spent the remaining hours before tea documenting her discoveries in a detailed letter addressed to Inspector Craddock, which she entrusted to Mrs. Kettering with instructions for its delivery should she fail to return from Elm House by evening. The precaution felt both melodramatic and essential, given the convenient accidents that had befallen previous investigators who had grown too curious about Little Wickham's mortality statistics. Elm House embodied its owner's character perfectly, with immaculate gardens concealing deadly secrets beneath their beautiful facade. Miss Marple noted the cherry laurel bush, recently pruned, and the careful arrangement of various toxic specimens that demonstrated Mrs. Pemberton's extensive botanical knowledge. The drawing room had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail, every element chosen for its contribution to the afternoon's purpose. Mrs. Pemberton greeted her guest with polished charm, her silver hair perfectly arranged, and her manner radiating the quiet authority of someone accustomed to controlling every social interaction. The tea service gleamed on the mahogany table, each piece positioned with precision that spoke to decades of practice in using hospitality as a weapon. Such a relief that the recent troubles have been resolved. Mrs. Pemberton began, pouring Earl Grey with steady hands. Poor Mr. Fletcher's confession, while tragic, has brought closure to our community, and dear Isabel is completely exonerated. Miss Marple accepted her cup with apparent gratitude while studying her hostess with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. Indeed, though I confess Mr. Fletcher's confession puzzled me somewhat. Such precise typing for a man with severe arthritis, and the language seemed rather elaborate for someone in such distress. A barely perceptible tightening around Mrs. Pemberton's eyes suggested the observation had struck home. "Guilt affects people differently," she replied smoothly. "Some become quite eloquent when unburdening their conscience." Conscience, Miss Marple mused, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. A powerful force indeed, though sometimes people confess to crimes they didn't commit, particularly when the alternative is exposing family secrets that have been carefully buried for generations. Mrs. Pemberton's smile remained fixed, but her breathing grew slightly shallow. "The past is best left undisturbed, Miss Marple. Old scandals serve no purpose except to hurt the innocent." "Quite true," Miss Marple agreed mildly. Yet Millicent was so interested in village history, particularly the connections between certain families and various unfortunate incidents over the years. She was especially intrigued by the botanical specimens she found growing near estate walls, despite their owners' meticulous gardening standards. The teacup trembled almost imperceptibly in Mrs. Pemberton's hands. Millicent's health affected her judgment in her final years. She developed rather fanciful notions. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost conversational. Her journal was quite detailed, though someone took the precaution of removing certain pages. Such a pity when historical documents become incomplete. She wrote extensively about patterns within patterns and about someone who wouldn't allow certain investigations to continue. Mrs. Pemberton set down her cup with deliberate care, her composure beginning to fray despite obvious efforts at control. "I find this conversation rather morbid. Perhaps we might discuss more pleasant topics." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone softening with apparent sympathy. "It must be exhausting, bearing such responsibility for the village's welfare. Knowing that someone close might be harboring dark secrets, manipulating events while maintaining a facade of respectability. It would require remarkable willpower to sustain such deception year after year." Mrs. Pemberton rose abruptly, her chair scraping against polished floorboards. Her face, usually so controlled, now showed barely suppressed fury. "I must be going, Miss Marple. Your musings today are quite unsettling." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes followed her hostess to the door. "Truth often is unsettling, Mrs. Pemberton, but like persistent weeds, it always finds ways to grow through cracks, no matter how carefully it's been buried. Mrs. Pemberton turned, her gaze hardening into something cold and calculating. Some weeds, Miss Marple, require very thorough treatment before they can spread. The morning after her revealing tea at Elm House brought an oppressive stillness to Little Wickham, as if the village itself sensed the approaching storm. Miss Marple understood that Mrs. Pemberton now knew the extent of her suspicions, transforming their relationship from cat and mouse into something far more dangerous. The killer had revealed her hand through that final, chilling threat, and Miss Marple recognized that time was running short before Mrs. Pemberton would act to eliminate the last witness to her decades of systematic murder. Miss Marple spent the early hours in careful preparation, not of evidence or traps, but of psychological strategy. She had learned long ago that the most effective way to expose a killer was not through dramatic confrontations or elaborate schemes, but through the simple application of pressure to the human psyche until it cracked under the weight of its own guilt. Mrs. Pemberton had maintained her facade through meticulous control and careful planning, but every killer possessed a breaking point where pride and fear would override caution. The opportunity she sought presented itself with the weekly Women's Institute meeting, scheduled for that very afternoon in the village hall. Mrs. Pemberton presided over these gatherings with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of village social life, making it the perfect stage for what Miss Marple intended to be their final encounter. The setting would provide witnesses while maintaining the appearance of innocent social interaction, allowing Miss Marple to apply psychological pressure without alerting Mrs. Pemberton to her true purpose until it was too late. The village hall buzzed with the gentle energy of women gathering for their traditional afternoon of tea and discussion. Mrs. Pemberton arrived precisely on time, resplendent in a perfectly tailored suit that spoke to her position as the village's unofficial social director. Her silver hair was arranged with characteristic precision, and her smile radiated the confident authority of someone who had never been seriously challenged. She conducted the meeting's opening business with practiced efficiency, her gaze occasionally flickering toward Miss Marple with the calculating attention of someone assessing a potential threat. Miss Marple positioned herself in a corner with her knitting, presenting the image of a harmless elderly woman more interested in her needlework than the proceedings around her. She waited patiently as the conversation drifted through the usual topics of village life, noting how Mrs. Pemberton steered discussions away from anything that might touch upon recent tragedies. The killer's confidence was evident in her relaxed manner, suggesting she believed the threat posed by Miss Marple had been adequately assessed and would soon be eliminated. The moment came when Mrs. Giles, with her characteristic lack of tact, brought up the subject of Dr. Rowe's sudden death. "Such a terrible shock after poor Mr. Fletcher," she declared, shaking her head sadly. "One might almost think our village was cursed with misfortune." Mrs. Pemberton offered the appropriate expressions of sympathy, her voice carefully modulated to convey both grief and resignation. Dr. Rowe had been under considerable strain, Mrs. Giles. The heart, sadly, can only bear so much pressure before it simply gives way to the burden. Miss Marple chose this moment to enter the conversation, her voice soft and conversational, carrying just far enough to be heard by the gathered women. It's remarkable, isn't it, how differently people respond to stress and guilt. Some find relief in confession, while others carry their burdens in silence until their bodies simply surrender to the weight. She paused, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. I had such an interesting conversation with Dr. Rowe just before his passing. He seemed particularly troubled by certain inconsistencies he had noticed. A subtle tension entered Mrs. Pemberton's posture, though her expression remained perfectly composed. Dr. Rowe was a conscientious man, Miss Marple. Perhaps he was simply projecting his own professional concerns onto tragic circumstances. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed mildly, her pale blue eyes meeting Mrs. Pemberton's steely gaze with deceptive innocence. Though he mentioned some rather specific observations about Mr. Blount's death, He found it curious, for instance, that the poison had been so precisely introduced into the individual glass rather than the common serving vessel. Such precision would require not only detailed chemical knowledge, but also intimate familiarity with the ceremonial protocols of village gatherings. Mrs. Pemberton's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. Her knuckles showed white as she gripped the delicate porcelain with increasing tension. Miss Marple continued with gentle relentlessness, each word carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. He was particularly intrigued by that faint, oily film on the elderflower jug. Such a small detail, easily overlooked by most observers, but one that suggested a very specific delivery method. Perhaps something as commonplace as laurel water, traditionally used to discourage wasps at summer gatherings. The effect was immediate and devastating. Mrs. Pemberton's carefully maintained composure cracked like fine porcelain under sudden pressure. Her face flushed, then went deathly pale, and her breathing became shallow and rapid. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp with barely controlled fury, "I find your morbid speculations both inappropriate and offensive. The police have concluded their investigation." "Indeed they have," Miss Marple replied with serene persistence. "But sometimes the most obvious conclusions are merely carefully constructed diversions designed to protect the true culprit while sacrificing convenient scapegoats." She looked directly at Mrs. Pemberton, her gentle voice carrying absolute conviction. "Millicent documented everything in her journal, you know. The patterns of death, the botanical specimens, the systematic elimination of anyone who might threaten certain family secrets. She even noted how carefully certain pages were removed from her records." Mrs. Pemberton rose abruptly from her chair, the sudden movement drawing every eye in the room. Her mask of respectability had finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "You know nothing," she hissed, her voice barely audible, yet vibrating with unmistakable menace. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, taking in the shocked faces of women who had respected and trusted her for decades, realizing too late how completely she had betrayed herself. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the gentle clicking of Miss Marple's knitting needles and the sound of Mrs. Pemberton's ragged breathing as she stood exposed before the community she had manipulated and terrorized for so many years. The silence that followed Mrs. Pemberton's outburst stretched like a taut wire through the village hall, every woman frozen by the electric tension crackling between the exposed killer and the gentle detective who had unmasked her. Mrs. Pemberton stood trembling beside her overturned chair, her carefully maintained facade of respectability lying in ruins around her feet. The mask she had worn for decades had finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath, and the assembled members of the Women's Institute stared in horrified fascination at the woman they had trusted and feared in equal measure. Miss Marple continued her knitting with serene composure, her pale blue eyes never leaving Mrs. Pemberton's face as she spoke in the same gentle, conversational tone that had proven so devastatingly effective. "The most remarkable aspect of your crimes, Mrs. Pemberton, was how you used your position as our village's social director to gain access to every gathering where deaths occurred. Your authority in arranging refreshments, your established habit of using botanical preparations, your intimate knowledge of everyone's secrets. It created perfect camouflage for systematic murder." At that precise moment, the hall door opened with quiet authority, and Inspector Craddock stepped inside. He had been waiting in the anteroom at Miss Marple's carefully timed request, listening to every word of the extraordinary confession unfolding within. His practiced eye took in the scene immediately. Mrs. Pemberton's wild-eyed desperation, the shocked faces of the village women, and Miss Marple's calm certainty that justice was finally being served. "Inspector," Miss Marple acknowledged with a slight nod. "How fortunate that you should arrive just as Mrs. Pemberton was explaining her methods to us." She gestured toward the trembling woman with her knitting needle. "Perhaps you would be interested in examining her handbag. particularly the small glass bottle she carries for what she calls wasp deterrent. Mrs. Pemberton clutched her black silk handbag to her chest like a shield, but Inspector Craddock's quiet authority brooked no resistance. From its depths, he withdrew a cut-glass scent bottle fitted with a precise dropper, its contents giving off the unmistakable bittersweet reek of prussic acid, even through the sealed stopper. The physical evidence was damning, confirming everything Miss Marple had deduced through careful observation and logical reasoning. "Cherry laurel extract," Miss Marple explained to the fascinated and horrified audience. "Concentrated to yield hydrogen cyanide in lethal doses." Mrs. Pemberton's established habit of brushing laurel water on serving trays to discourage wasps provided perfect cover for introducing poison into individual glasses. The oily film we observed on the elderflower jug was residue from this delivery method, applied with surgical precision to Mr. Blount's glass moments before the ceremonial toast. The explanation unlocked the full scope of Mrs. Pemberton's crimes, stretching back decades to the original Thornton scandal that had shaped Little Wickham's social hierarchy. Miss Marple detailed how Isabel Price's grandmother, Margaret Thornton, had borne a child to Edmund Pemberton, threatening the family's reputation until her convenient death from apparent consumption. Each subsequent murder had eliminated witnesses to this founding crime or investigators who grew too curious about patterns within patterns. Geoffrey Ashworth discovered irregularities in property transfers, Miss Marple continued methodically. Millicent documented suspicious mortality statistics. Mr. Blount uncovered genealogical connections that threatened to expose everything. Dr. Rowe possessed medical knowledge that could question official causes of death. Each posed a threat to the carefully constructed web of lies and murder that supported your position. Mrs. Pemberton's composure finally shattered completely under the weight of exposure. "They were all threats to the natural order," she snarled, her voice rising to a pitch that made several women flinch. Blount with his meddling investigations, that sanctimonious doctor with his suspicious questions, even poor Millicent with her ridiculous theories. They would have destroyed everything I spent my life protecting, turned this peaceful village into a cesspit of scandal and recrimination. The confession was complete now, delivered in her own words before a room full of witnesses. Mrs. Pemberton had revealed not merely her guilt in recent murders, but the scope of crime stretching back generations. Her twisted justifications, protecting family honor, maintaining social order, eliminating threats to community peace, only made her guilt more damning by demonstrating the cold calculation behind each killing. "Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton," Inspector Craddock said formally, producing his handcuffs with practiced efficiency, "I arrest you for the murders of Lionel Blount, Geoffrey Rowe, James Fletcher, and others as yet to be determined. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence against you." Mrs. Pemberton straightened with a final flash of her old authority, her chin lifting defiantly as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I regret nothing," she declared to the room at large. "Everything I did was necessary to protect this village from those who would have destroyed it." As Inspector Craddock led her away, the women of Little Wickham sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend how their respected leader had been revealed as a calculating killer whose crimes had shaped their community for generations. Miss Marple quietly packed away her knitting, her work finally complete, though she knew the village would need considerable time to heal from wounds so brutally exposed. The morning after Mrs. Pemberton's dramatic arrest brought an unsettling quiet to Little Wickham, as if the village itself was learning to breathe again after decades of carefully controlled suffocation. Doors opened more cautiously, conversations carried undertones of bewildered relief, and the familiar rhythms of daily life resumed with the tentative quality of people rediscovering safety. Miss Marple observed this collective processing from Rose Cottage, understanding that communities, like individuals, required time to heal from such profound betrayal by someone they had trusted implicitly. Inspector Craddock arrived early with the subdued manner of a man whose professional confidence had been thoroughly shaken. His investigation had expanded exponentially once Mrs. Pemberton's confession opened floodgates that revealed crimes stretching back 30 years. "You were right about everything," he admitted over tea, his usual authority replaced by genuine humility. "The scope of her deception exceeds anything in my experience." Her meticulous records, discovered in a locked cabinet at Elm House, documented not only recent murders, but a chilling catalogue of systematic elimination that had shaped Little Wycombe's entire social structure. The cherry laurel bush in Mrs. Pemberton's garden yielded damning evidence when forensic experts examined its carefully tended branches. Chemical analysis confirmed years of extraction and concentration of prussic acid, while her greenhouse revealed an extensive collection of toxic plants, each labeled with scientific precision and accompanied by detailed notes about dosages and methods. The woman who had presented herself as the village's moral guardian had been conducting a private laboratory of death beneath her facade of domestic respectability. Isabel Price's immediate release from house arrest brought its own complications as the young teacher struggled to process how thoroughly she had been framed. Miss Marple visited her that evening, finding her pale but resolute. "I don't understand how someone so respected could do such terrible things," Isabel confessed, her voice still hoarse with emotion. Miss Marple offered gentle explanation about the original Thornton scandal and how Mrs. Pemberton's twisted protection of family secrets had evolved into systematic murder. "Human nature is complex, my dear. The threads of good and evil are often interwoven in ways we least expect." The revelation that James Fletcher's suicide had been meticulously staged murder devastated his family while providing crucial evidence of Mrs. Pemberton's sophistication. The typed confession, now understood as her fabrication, demonstrated her ability to manipulate even intimate details of victims' lives. Handwriting analysis confirmed she had composed the document herself, studying Fletcher's correspondence to mimic his style while incorporating village secrets only she could have known. Dr. Rowe's death required complete re-examination in light of these revelations. His medical records, discovered in his surgery, contained detailed notes about suspicious symptoms and questionable causes of death that had troubled his professional conscience for years. His attempt to share these concerns with Miss Marple in the churchyard had sealed his fate, marking him as another witness requiring permanent silencing. Forensic examination confirmed he had been poisoned during Mrs. Pemberton's seemingly innocent visit to discuss memorial arrangements. The village's collective reaction varied dramatically among residents. Mrs. Giles found herself unable to bake, her hands trembling from shock at how completely she had been deceived. Miss Finch confessed to the vicar her utter blindness, admitting that rigid adherence to social convention had prevented her from seeing true evil beneath respectability's surface. Thomas Albright, whose theatrical sensibilities had once seemed harmless, discovered the harshness of reality and decided to practice silence rather than dramatic speculation. Millicent's blue leather journal became crucial evidence once Inspector Craddock produced the 3 missing pages retrieved from Mrs. Pemberton's desk. The restored entries revealed the full scope of her friend's growing awareness and fear, documenting botanical observations, timing patterns, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened carefully buried secrets. Miss Marple pasted the torn edges carefully, noting Millicent's final entry. "Jane will know." It was both trust and farewell, efficiently phrased as always. The historical pattern emerged with devastating clarity, as parish records confirmed the original Thornton scandal's true scope. Margaret Thornton had indeed borne Edmund Pemberton's illegitimate child, but the cover-up had involved far more than financial pressure. Mrs. Pemberton's own grandmother had orchestrated Margaret's death through slow poisoning disguised as consumption, establishing a family tradition of using botanical murder to eliminate inconvenient truths. As official notices multiplied on the post office board announcing reopened inquests and postponed memorials, the village struggled with the knowledge that their entire social structure had been built on systematic deception and murder. The comfortable assumptions about neighbors and community leaders lay shattered, forcing everyone to question everything they thought they knew about Little Wickham's peaceful facade. Miss Marple walked the lanes with unhurried purpose, allowing time to resume its patient work of healing. She reflected on the particular tragedy of intelligence and organizational ability corrupted by obsession with control and respectability. Mrs. Pemberton could have been the village's greatest benefactor, but had chosen instead to become its most dangerous predator, hiding behind authority while destroying lives with calculated precision. In the evening, she visited the church alone, sitting where Millicent had sat and remembering their youth when promises seemed simpler and secrets less deadly. She understood now why she had returned after 30 years, not merely for Millicent's letter, but because patterns persist where people do, and kindness requires the same attention that justice demands. Little Wickham would heal, but it would never again mistake surface respectability for genuine virtue. The weeks following Mrs. Pemberton's arrest brought an unsettling quiet to Little Wickham, as if the village itself was learning to breathe without the suffocating control that had masqueraded as protective authority for decades. Inspector Craddock's expanded investigation revealed the true scope of her crimes. 17 suspicious deaths over 30 years, each initially attributed to natural causes, but now understood as systematic elimination of threats to her carefully constructed reality. The cherry laurel bush yielded enough concentrated poison to kill dozens, while her greenhouse records demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of botanical toxins that would have impressed university botanists. The trial concluded with Mrs. Pemberton receiving multiple life sentences, her composed demeanor in the dock serving as a final testament to the calculating intelligence that had made her crimes so devastatingly effective. She showed no remorse, maintaining to the end that her actions had been necessary to preserve order and respectability. The judge's summation described her as a woman whose obsession with control had transformed protective instincts into predatory calculation, words that echoed through Little Wickham long after the headlines faded. Hidden compartments at Elm House yielded damning evidence that confirmed the historical pattern Miss Marple had suspected. Property records revealed systematic transfer of land from vulnerable families to those aligned with Pemberton interests, creating the economic foundation for decades of control and coercion. The original Thornton scandal had involved not merely social pressure, but deliberate murder, establishing a family tradition of using botanical poisons to eliminate inconvenient truths that threatened their reputation. Isabel Price resumed her teaching duties with quiet determination, though the experience of being framed for murder had left visible marks on her gentle nature. The village children, with their instinctive ability to sense adult distress, rallied around their teacher with touching loyalty. She established a herb garden behind the classroom, carefully labeling rue and rosemary, foxglove and fennel, with precise notes about which plants heal and which should be admired only at a distance. The educational project became both practical lesson and symbolic gesture, teaching distinction between beneficial and dangerous, while acknowledging that knowledge itself was neither good nor evil. Only its application determined moral consequence. The Women's Institute disbanded temporarily, its members unable to gather in the hall where Mrs. Pemberton's mask had finally slipped. Mrs. Giles suggested forming a new organization with different traditions, acknowledging that some associations carried too much psychological weight to continue unchanged. Their first meeting was subdued but resolute, with women speaking not of gossip but of shared trauma and the need for communal rebuilding. Dr. Matthews, the young physician who replaced Dr. Rowe, brought fresh perspective unburdened by knowledge of past complicity. His thorough review of medical records confirmed suspicious patterns in earlier deaths, while establishing new protocols for documenting unusual symptoms. The village's health improved markedly once residents no longer feared that seeking medical attention might expose them to additional danger from someone they trusted with their lives. James Fletcher's family found solace when forensic analysis proved Mrs. Pemberton had typed his fabricated confession, her typewriter's distinctive misaligned letters matching the suicide note perfectly. The real motive for his murder was his growing unease about old bank records, which he had begun reviewing in light of Mr. Blount's investigation, uncovering the financial manipulations that had enabled decades of systematic control. The parish church installed a memorial window honoring victims of untimely death, its abstract design avoiding specific references while acknowledging loss and suffering that had been deliberately hidden. The vicar's dedication spoke of truth emerging from darkness and communities finding strength through honest confrontation with their past, themes that resonated deeply with residents still processing the magnitude of deception they had endured. Miss Marple observed these changes from Rose Cottage, noting how conversations resumed more naturally and children played with less supervision. Her decision to remain permanently in Little Wickham reflected both practical necessity and deeper understanding of community healing. The village needed time to process the scope of betrayal by someone they had trusted implicitly, and her presence provided quiet reassurance that justice had been served while vigilance continued. As autumn deepened into winter, Little Wickham settled into rhythms that acknowledged both continuity and change. The village green still hosted seasonal celebrations, though with different organizers and modified traditions that reflected hard-won wisdom about the dangers of concentrating authority in single individuals. Miss Marple's morning walks and afternoon knitting sessions became fixtures of village routine, offering stability during fundamental readjustment. Her final entry in Millicent's blue journal reflected on patterns within patterns and the eternal vigilance required to protect communities from those who would exploit trust for personal advantage. She wrote of friendship that transcends death, of justice that sometimes arrives through circuitous routes, and of the quiet satisfaction that comes from ensuring that evil, however cleverly disguised, ultimately faces consequences. The story of Mrs. Pemberton's crimes would become local legend, passed down as cautionary tale about masks that evil can wear and the importance of questioning authority that seems too perfect, too controlling, too invested in maintaining facades of respectability. Miss Marple understood that her work was complete, not because all mysteries had been solved, but because the village had learned to see clearly again, to trust wisely, and to remember that the most dangerous predators often hide behind the most respectable smiles.